Back when I was fresh out of college, I was living in a tiny studio apartment somewhere in Chicago. It wasn't anything special, a single room on the top floor of a three-story building. I picked it mainly because the rent was easy on my wallet, and it was pretty close to my job. As a 23-year-old with student debt and no savings, being picky wasn't really an option. The apartment was simple, clean, and most importantly, mine. The only window looked out onto a narrow alleyway. On the other side was another apartment building, almost identical to mine in design. The alley itself was barely wide enough for one car to squeeze through, and during the daytime, it barely saw any sunlight, making it pretty gloomy. At night, pitch black. That didn't really bother me much since I was working late shifts bartending at a lounge out on the north side end. I'd usually get home around 2:30 or 3 in the morning. I'd quickly whip up some food, then just mindlessly scroll on my phone until I passed out. But about a month into living there, I noticed something strange one night. I just walked in, kicked off my shoes, and flicked on the overhead light when I thought I saw a flicker moving in the window across the alley, maybe a curtain twitch or something. I froze for a second, trying to process what I saw. When I looked again, though, the window was dark and still, no movement at all. I shrugged it off, thinking I probably startled someone. Maybe it was just a draft or some weird optical illusion. The next night, it happened again. As soon as I turned on the light, the curtain in that same window shifted subtly. And this time, I was sure I saw definite movement. A hand just barely pulling the curtain back before letting it drop. I couldn't see the person behind it, and the neighboring apartment's lights were off. It was just a quick flash of motion in what felt like an endless black void. What really had my attention was the fact that I'd never seen the lights on in that apartment before. I always assumed it was empty. Yet here was a shadowy movement in the dark. That night I didn't sleep well at all. I kept thinking about that hand, about what I'd seen. Over the following week, I started paying closer attention. No matter what, every night, within seconds of me flipping on my lights, the curtain would subtly shift. It was always the same, a slow parting of the curtain, just enough to see a hint of the dark, empty space behind it before it fell back into place. I decided to test it. Some nights I'd leave my lights off altogether, sitting silently by the window just observing. Nothing happened. But every time I switched the lights on, even just the dim glow from my couch, the curtain would react, shifting slightly as if someone was watching me. It was obvious person was watching. I tried to convince myself it was just someone who liked to look out their window at night, but the timing of everything didn't add up. It always coincided perfectly with my arrival home. That was too much of a coincidence to ignore. I asked my landlord about the apartment across the alley, and he told me it had been vacant for months. I pressed him, asking if maybe someone had moved in recently, but he just shook his head and teased that I was being paranoid. I even thought about calling the police a couple of times, but chose not to, feeling silly about reporting someone who might just be lurking outside an empty apartment window. Still, the feeling of being watched was steadily getting worse each night. Then, one night, things really took a turn. I got home around 4 a.m. after a long night of work. My bar had hosted a private event. Cleanup had dragged on and I was exhausted. When I went to open my door, I spotted something jammed in the doorframe. At first, I thought it was just some junk mail or a flyer. But when I pulled it out, I saw it was a crumpled note. All it said was "Hey" in handwriting. My legs felt like they turned to jelly immediately, because my first thought was about the apartment across the alley, the one I'd been watching. Without wasting a second, I ran to the window and looked across, expecting to see someone. The curtain was drawn and there was nothing visible. Panic set in and I called my friend Jamie, who was across town. I was freaking out, so she told me to come over right away. I grabbed my backpack, shoved a few essentials inside, and took off. The next day, I went back to my landlord, demanding to see that apartment. He hesitated but finally agreed to meet me there with the key. When we entered, it was dusty and completely empty. No furniture, just bare walls and floorboards that creaked like they were 100 years old. In the back corner, facing my window, was a single metal folding chair. It was directly in front of the window, the angle making it obvious someone had access to an apartment that should have been locked and empty. Police were called immediately, and they searched the unit. I believe they took fingerprints, but they came up with nothing. It was a sickening realization the entire time. I'd been right. Someone was watching me, lurking in that apartment. How long they'd been doing it, I honestly didn't want to know. It made me sick imagining how many nights they might have been hidden in there, watching through that window. That same week, I moved out of that place for good. To this day, I have no idea who was behind it, how they managed to get in, or how long it might have been going on if I hadn't found that note saying, "Hey." Sometimes I still wonder if it was my landlord. But deep down, I know he wouldn't have gone over to that apartment to remove that chair before showing me the place. It just doesn't add up. I still dream about that window and those shadows. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up convinced someone is still watching me. Switching gears, I remember when I was just 12, my family moved out to a remote area in Oregon, miles away from anything resembling a town. It was on a big chunk of land surrounded by dense pine forest. It was peaceful, quiet, but honestly, it felt pretty isolating. The house was from the 1940s, squeaky floors, a spooky attic, and a rundown shed about 30 feet from the back door. The shed was filled with old tools and junk from the previous owner. My dad kept meaning to clean it out, but he never did. We mostly stayed away from that shed, but I remember the first odd thing I ever noticed. It was a weeknight, late, probably close to midnight. I was laying in bed, reading with a flashlight under the covers, when suddenly I heard Max, our golden retriever, barking like crazy. Max was super friendly and usually very calm, but when he went into full-on barking mode, I knew something was wrong. I got up slowly and peeked out my window. Max was facing right at the shed, barking into the darkness. The motion sensor light by the back door was on, casting long, shifting shadows across the yard. I couldn't see anyone, but Max kept barking fiercely. I didn't go outside, just watched for a few minutes until he calmed down, then went back to bed. The next morning, we found deep boot prints pressed into the dirt between the house and the shed. My dad shrugged it off, saying it could have been a neighbor passing through or some random drifter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. Over the next few weeks, Max kept barking at that shed, sometimes multiple times a night. We'd look outside, see nothing, but the footprints kept appearing always, leading right up to the shed, never away. Then around 2 a.m. one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside my window. I froze, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, heading toward the shed. I peeked through the blinds and saw the outside light flicker on for a second. And there, standing just beside the shed, was a tall figure. Ruho, I couldn't see clearly because he was in shadow. He was wearing what looked like a dirty gray coat, his face obscured. Then the light went out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd faint. I backed away from the window, woke up my parents. My dad grabbed his rifle, headed outside, but when he checked, the figure was gone. The footprints, however, were still fresh and led right up to the shed. This time, my dad braced himself and opened the shed doors, expecting to find someone inside. Instead, all he saw was a bunch of rusty tools and old tarps, nothing else. He locked it back up with a new lock and reinforced the doors. Things were quiet for a little while, but a month later, Max disappeared. We searched everywhere through the woods, down the road, even knocking on neighbors' doors. But he was just gone. I was devastated. I held on to hope, thinking he'd come back, maybe got lost in the woods. That night I couldn't sleep at all. My mind kept circling around the shed, about Max, and about that strange man I saw. Around 3 a.m., I heard the back door creak open. I got up silently and tiptoed toward the hallway. My dad was already awake, holding his rifle. We both reached the back door just in time to see the motion light flicker on again. And standing there was the same man, this time holding something in his hand, a knife in one hand, Max's collar in the other. The sight hit me like a punch to the stomach. I felt like I was losing air, weightless, like I might fall right over. My dad yelled and raised his rifle, but the man turned and ran into the woods. We called the police, and they searched but found nothing. Inside that shed, though, what they discovered made my stomach churn. Somion had cleared out the floor, leaving only dirt. There in the dirt, they found crude symbols carved into the ground, disturbing images. And in the corner, animal bones perhaps, but still unsettling. Behind a hidden panel in the shed wall, officers found a backpack filled with unfamiliar belongings, wallets, watches, old clothes that looked like they belonged to someone. The strangest was a notebook filled with strange symbols, jagged handwriting, and confusing sketches of houses, families, and eyes. I believe that notebook was some kind of message, saying he'd been watching us just like he had other families. The police took everything they found. That night, as we packed up to leave, I glanced out the window one last time with police tape fluttering in the wind, everything quiet. But just beyond, maybe 10 feet into the trees, I saw a face staring back at me for a second, then it vanished when I blinked. I screamed for my dad, yelling, "He's back," rushing to the window. My dad ran outside trying to find him, but the figure was gone. I pointed straight at that shed, and he sprinted in that direction, gun ready, shouting into the dark. But we never caught him. The frustration, the anger, it was unreal. It felt like a nightmare come to life, knowing that a dangerous, possibly murderous man had been lurking right outside our home, knowing Max was gone because of him. We left that place a few days later, moving to a quieter part of Oregon. Fast forward to summer 2018. My friends and I, Abby, Marcus, his younger brother Tim, Tim's girlfriend Hannah, and Mepland, a weekend getaway in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We were all in our early 20s, fresh out of college, desperate to disconnect from the world. We picked a spot deep inside the national park, far from cell signals, surrounded by thick trees, pine scent in the air, and total isolation. Our first night was pretty typical. We hiked in, set up camp near a small lake, pitched 3 tents, started a fire, and cooked hot dogs and marshmallows. We told stories, drank a little, and stayed up late staring at the stars. It was peaceful, almost tranquil. Then, on the second night, things got really weird. Around 11 p.m., we were still laughing and hanging out when Marcus suddenly froze and pointed toward the woods, asking if anyone saw that movement. We all looked but saw nothing. He swore he saw a figure duck behind a tree, probably about 30 or 40 yards away. Tim shrugged it off, saying it was probably a deer or something. But then, 20 minutes later, we heard a loud snap like a brankrite in that same direction. Everyone got spooked, and Hannah said she'd had enough and wanted to go to bed. We all agreed, dousing the fire, zipping up the tents, and trying to get some sleep. That night, I woke up to something I'll never forget. Breathing just outside my tent, maybe 10 feet from my head. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, maybe half asleep. But no, the breathing continued, steady and heavy. I listened and realized it wasn't just a side effect of sleep. I was with 4 other people, so it couldn't be one of them. Could have been someone outside to pee, I guess, but I didn't hear a stream or any normal sounds. The breathing sounded almost like an old smoker, short, labored breaths. I reached for my flashlight, but I was too scared to turn it on. Instead, I just waited, listening. The breathing moved from one side of the tent to the other, and then it suddenly stopped. I held my breath, feeling relieved that maybe one of my friends was outside and just peeing. I finally drifted back asleep. When we all met up in the morning for breakfast, Marcus looked tense, like he had something to say. He told us someone had been outside our tent last night. Hannah nodded and confirmed she heard it too. She said whoever it was walked around the tent more than once, and it might have been more than one person. I asked if anyone had gotten up to pee, assuming that's what we heard. Tim said he did, but he also thought he saw a figure crouched near the fire pit around 4 a.m. We checked the ground around the tent's, footprints everywhere. In a muddy patch, one footprint was clearly barefoot. Not shod, just a human foot. That was strange because they led into the woods and disappeared. We tried to pretend it was just some weird hiker or prankster, but it didn't feel like a joke. Later that night, we stayed up late, nervously talking around a bigger fire, keeping our flashlights close. Then, around 2 a.m., we heard that sickening sound, the crisp crunch of Levisan. It wasn't alone. There was a voicey, a low, muffled human voice. Marcus flicked on his flashlight, and for a second we saw who it was. Standing behind a tree was a naked man crouched down, like an animal caught in the act. The moment they saw us, he scrambled back into the woods. We were all stunned, frozen in place. Hannah suggested we pack up and leave immediately, but Marcus and I disagreed. Going into the woods that late at night, trying to pack everything up and find our way out, that would be horrifically dangerous, especially with that man possibly stalking us. I swear, that night might have been one of the worst nights of my life. I couldn't sleep. I stayed wide awake the entire time, and maybe that saved me. I kept waiting, anxiously listening for any sign of movement, crunching leaves, snapping sticks. And then I heard it. Softly, I whispered under my breath, "Please, just let it be a deer." A few moments later, in the quiet darkness, I heard a voice, strangely calm but creepy, say, "I see you guys." It wasn't any of my friends. I didn't know if they'd heard it too, but none of them reacted. I was too scared to respond, so I just stayed silent. And what happened next I'll never forget. The tent shifted just slightly, enough for me to shoot up in alarm. I watched as the zipper of my tent started slowly unzipping inch by inch. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, and my friends must have done the same. Whoever was outside, I guess, took off running, but I'll never know for sure. All of us yelled at each other, trying to communicate through the fabric. I hurried to zip it back up, pulling it all the way and sealing myself inside. That night, I didn't hear any footsteps or breathing again. I just stayed glued in my tent, watching as dawn broke, the first light creeping into the woods. By morning, we hurriedly packed everything up and left that place behind. The tension didn't lift, though, not even a little. On our way out, we told the park rangers everything. They listened carefully, then casually mentioned they'd had reports of a man, or maybe more than one, living out there, sometimes stealing, sometimes worse. I didn't ask what that meant. My mind was already racing, imagining all the terrible possibilities. We just joked about it in the car, but honestly, I didn't find it funny. That night in the woods, that moment with the tent zipper, that broke something inside me. I don't think I can ever go camping again. The fear, the uncertainty, never knowing who was out there, watching you, can't shake that kind of worst-case scenario. And that feeling of being watched, it still haunts me.